Before the first city was built, before the first kingdom rose or fell, there was the blade, not the sword, not yet. Something cruder, something born not from ambition, but from desperation. A sharpened edge pressed into bronze, a shape hammered by hands that understood only one truth, that the thing standing between a man and his death was the weapon in his fist. And so it began. Egypt. 3,000 years before the Common Era. A civilization that built monuments to eternity was also building something far more practical. The khopesh was not elegant. It was not refined. It was the answer to a brutal question. How do you kill a man who is wearing armor, who is taller than you, who has a spear pointed at your chest? The answer was the curve. That sickle-shaped blade, forged first in copper and later in bronze, was designed to do something no straight blade could manage. It hooked, it pulled, it reached around shields when thrusting was useless. A khopesh wielded by an Egyptian warrior wasn't just a weapon. It was a problem-solving device, a way of thinking about violence that no one had fully articulated before. In the chaos of a chariot battle at Kadesh, two great empires colliding in dust and screaming horses, an Egyptian infantryman would have held this blade not like a sword, but like an extension of his intent. The hook caught a Hittite soldier behind the knee. The pull brought him down. What happened next required no refinement. But here is the thing about the khopesh that no one ever mentions. That curve, that beautiful, ingenious curve, was also a limitation. It made thrusting nearly impossible. In tight formations, in narrow corridors, against organized infantry, it became awkward, clumsy. A weapon designed for open battlefield became a liability the moment the battlefield changed. And the battlefield always changes. Rome understood something that Egypt never fully grasped. That individual genius, no matter how deadly, is less reliable than collective discipline. That 100 ordinary men moving as one organism could defeat 1,000 exceptional warriors moving as individuals. The gladius was built for this philosophy. Short, brutally short. 50 to 60 centimeters of double-edged iron that looked almost insulting compared to the weapons it would eventually displace. Enemies who first encountered Roman legions sometimes laughed at the size of their swords. They stopped laughing the moment the shield wall closed. Because the gladius was never meant to be used with wide, sweeping strokes. It was not a slashing weapon. It was a stabbing weapon, a thrusting weapon. In the crush of a Roman testudo, shoulder to shoulder with shields locked, there was no room for a backstroke, no room for a swing. There was only the 6 inches of space between your shield and the enemy's body. And the gladius was designed to fill that space with death. A legionnaire at the Battle of Cannae, surrounded on 3 sides by Hannibal's forces, did not panic in the way a warrior with a longer weapon might. The compression of the battlefield, which should have neutralized his effectiveness, was exactly the condition in which his weapon became most lethal. He did not need to swing. He pushed his shield forward, found the gap between armor and neck, and drove the point home. The gladius worked because it trusted the system more than the individual. But the system had a weakness. When Rome eventually faced enemies who refused to fight in the Roman way, enemies who scattered, who fought in trees and marshes and mountain passes, the short sword became a liability. Reach mattered, and the gladius had none. Every answer, it seems, contains its own question. The North answered differently. While Rome was engineering war as a bureaucratic process, the Norse were treating it as something closer to theology. The Viking sword was not simply a weapon. It was a covenant, a declaration of identity, a thing passed from father to son with more ceremony than land or title. These blades were pattern-welded in their earliest forms, iron rods twisted together and hammered flat, creating those unmistakable serpentine patterns in the steel. The process was brutal and time-consuming, but the result was a sword with flexibility and toughness that simpler blades could not match. It would bend before it broke. In the freezing, wet conditions of northern raids, a blade that didn't shatter was worth more than a blade that was merely sharp. But what separated the Viking sword from everything that had come before was not its metallurgy. It was its weight, the mass of it, the way it transferred momentum into whatever it contacted. At the siege of Paris in 885, a Norse warrior standing at the river's edge, waiting for the signal to advance, held a sword that weighed nearly 2 kilograms with a blade over 80 centimeters long. When that blade came down on an unarmored Frankish defender, it was not a cut, it was a verdict. The weight did not require perfection of technique. It required only commitment. And yet, the single-handed grip, however powerful, limited control at longer ranges. The fuller, that groove running down the blade's center, reduced weight without sacrificing strength. But the sword's balance meant it favored power over precision. Against heavily armored opponents, it sometimes slid off plate rather than penetrating it. The Norse knew this. They compensated with aggression, with fury, with the psychological weapon of reputation, because a warrior who had made his sword famous through decades of violence carried that fame into every future fight. But fear, it turned out, was not a substitute for engineering. On the other side of the world, in a nation that had spent centuries in civil war, a different kind of mind was working on a different kind of problem. Japanese swordsmiths understood something that no European metallurgist had yet discovered. That steel was not uniform, that the outside of a blade needed to be harder, capable of holding an edge, while the core needed to be softer, capable of absorbing shock without shattering. They solved this by folding high-carbon steel around a low-carbon core, tamahagain, a word that translates with devastating simplicity as jewel steel. The katana that emerged from this process was not the heaviest sword. It was not the longest. It was not designed for the press of formation fighting or the chaos of mass infantry warfare. It was designed for something far more specific. It was designed to end a fight in a single movement. The curved blade existed not for aesthetic reasons, but for physics. As the katana was drawn from its scabbard, the curve itself generated a cutting motion. The draw stroke and the killing stroke became a single unified action. By the time an opponent registered that the sword was being drawn, the cut was already complete. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, in the chaos that decided the fate of Japan for 2.5 centuries, samurai engaged in the compressed terror of close quarters combat found that the katana's true advantage was psychological as much as physical. Its reputation preceded it. The knowledge that a single, properly executed strike could sever limbs, could cut through neck and shoulder simultaneously, changed the way opponents moved, changed the way they breathed. But the katana's greatest strength was inseparable from its greatest vulnerability. It was optimized, perfected for a specific kind of fighting between specific kinds of warriors in a specific cultural context. Against a European knight in full-plate armor, the katana's edge, however miraculous, would struggle against hardened steel. It was a precision instrument, and precision instruments fail the moment the conditions for which they were designed cease to exist. Europe, meanwhile, was facing an arms race with no ceiling. As plate armor became more complete, more sophisticated, more capable of turning aside every blade anyone had yet designed, the question became existential. How do you kill a man when the man is wearing a metal shell? The answer was not to make a better sword. The answer was to make a bigger one. The Zweihänder emerged from Germany in the 15th century, and it was, in every measurable sense, excessive. Up to 2 meters long, over 3 kilograms of steel, a weapon that required not just strength but a specific kind of brutal athleticism. The men who wielded it, the Doppelsöldner, the double-pay soldiers of the Landsknecht armies, were not ordinary soldiers. They were specialists. And they were paid twice the standard rate because what they did was twice as dangerous. Their job was to walk directly toward the enemy pike formation, not around it. toward it, into the forest of 12-foot poles leveled at their chests. And with this enormous blade sweeping in massive figure-8 patterns to physically knock the pikes aside, to create a gap in the formation through which cavalry or infantry could pour. The Zweihänder in this moment was not fighting individual opponents. It was fighting formations. It was fighting geometry. A soldier who watched a Doppelsöldner advance knew that the mathematical reality of their situation, dozens of pikes against one sword, should have made it impossible. And yet the blade kept swinging. Because the alternative was stepping back, and stepping back was not in their contract. The flaw, if it can be called that, was inherent in the scale. The Zweihänder was a battlefield weapon in the most literal sense. In any enclosed space, in a corridor, a doorway, a burning building, it became almost useless. The swing radius required open sky, and no sword is useful only in open sky. The world once again had made a weapon so specialized it bordered on absurdity. And the world once again demanded something different. What followed was not a discovery. It was a convergence. The longsword emerged across medieval Europe, not from a single inventor or a single culture, but from a slow collective recognition that everything learned from every previous blade needed to be reconciled, consolidated, made whole. A meter to a meter and a half of double-edged steel, a grip long enough for two hands, but not so long that one hand couldn't manage it when the other was occupied with a shield or a grapple. A cross guard that protected the hand but also served as a striking surface. A pommel heavy enough to counterbalance the blade, but also, and this is where it becomes remarkable, heavy enough to be used as a weapon itself when the blade became impractical. This was the first sword that came with a philosophy of its own. The German master Hans Talhofer and the Italian master Fiore de Liberi wrote entire systems of combat built around the long sword. Not just techniques, systems, ways of thinking about a fight as something fluid and dynamic rather than a simple exchange of strikes. The concept of binding, where two blades meet and the fight becomes a wrestling match of leverage and pressure, was longsword doctrine. Half-swording, where a warrior gripped his own blade with the gauntleted hand to use the sword as a short spear against armor gaps, was longsword doctrine. Even Mordschlag, the murder stroke, where the warrior flipped the sword entirely and used the grip as a bludgeon against helmeted opponents, was longsword doctrine. This was a weapon that acknowledged its own limitations and built the limitations into the system of use. Picture a German knight at a tournament in 1390, facing an opponent in nearly identical plate armor. The first exchange of strikes tells both men that edges are useless here. Without a word, without hesitation, both shift. One grips his blade halfway down the fuller. The other drops into a wrestling stance. The fight becomes something ancient and something entirely new simultaneously. Part sword, part grapple, part geometry, part physics. There were no witnesses to this specific moment. There didn't need to be. It happened 10,000 times across a century in tournament grounds and muddy fields and castle courtyards, because the longsword was a system sophisticated enough to ask its wielder to think rather than simply react. And yet, the longsword was not perfect. No sword ever was. Against the mass firepower of organized firearms, against the pike and shot revolution that swept European warfare in the 16th century, even the most sophisticated blade became obsolete, not because it failed, but because the context for its use ceased to exist. The battlefield moved on. This is the haunting truth that sits beneath all of it. Every one of these blades was the answer to a question that the world eventually stopped asking. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every hard-won lesson in metallurgy and technique and combat psychology was rendered obsolete, not by a better blade, but by a different kind of violence entirely. The frightening part is not that humanity kept building more effective weapons. The frightening part is how naturally it came, how each generation, inheriting the dead ends and failed experiments of the one before, looked at the accumulated wreckage of human ingenuity and thought, "We can do better than this," and then did.